Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today, archaeologist Dr. Michael Hasel will join us to talk about Lachish, a very important biblical city mentioned over 20 times in the Old Testament. Destroyed by the Assyrian Empire in 701 BC, Lachish was the second most important city in Judah after Jerusalem, and was very important in the formation of Judah at the time of King Rehoboam. Dr. Hasel is the co-director of the fourth expedition to Lachish, and he joins us today to share his expertise on the subject. Dr. Hasel, welcome back to Digging for Truth.
Great to be with you again. Thank you.
Well, we're glad that you're here again, and when we say again, it's because you were in a previous episode with us about Khirbet Qeiyafa, and there's a relationship between these two sites. We're going to talk about that today. And for folks who are watching, want to know a little bit about your background, they can watch that episode in the first segment. You give them a little bio. But today, we're going to jump right into it. So we're talking about a city called Lachish, and a lot of people maybe new to the Bible or new Christians watching the show going, Lachish, what is that? Why is that important? Well, I'm going to let you tell them about this important city.
Well, as you said, it's mentioned over 20 times, I think 23 times in the Old Testament. First time it appears is in the conquest period as Israel is coming into the land of Canaan. It is then mentioned again during the time of Rehoboam, who is the son of Solomon. He is the king responsible for the kingdom splitting in two, for the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, after the reign of his father Solomon. And then Lachish, after that time, becomes one of the most prominent cities in ancient Judah, arguably the second most important city after Jerusalem, based on the archaeological evidence that we have there, based on its descriptions in the Bible. It seems like Lachish is always the site, both for the Assyrian campaign and the Babylonian campaign, that needs to be taken first, or just before Jerusalem is taken, as the Assyrians and the Babylonians march up into the hill country. So Lachish was a very heavily fortified city. It has a huge fortress. We call it the Palace Fort, right in the middle of the site, on the Acropolis, on the top of the site. And this is the largest Iron Age building in the entire country of Israel that has been uncovered archaeologically. It's a huge building, and it was uncovered, of course, by the earlier expeditions at the site, primarily the British expedition in the 30s.
Okay, so you're mentioning the British expedition. You are the co-director of the fourth expedition, so that shows you how important this city is. By the way, we haven't talked in a long time, so congratulations on that. I mean, it's been a number of years that you've been digging there, but that's remarkable. It's such an important city.
It is, and so the first expedition was the British expedition. The second expedition was the Tel Aviv expedition by Aharoni. The third expedition was the expedition by David Yushishkin, also from Tel Aviv University, in the 1970s and 80s. That was a very large expedition. And then our expedition came in after that point in time and started in 2013. So it's a really big privilege to be part of working at such a major site. And it's really part of a regional project. Began with Khirbet Qeiyafa, then we surveyed at Sucho. We have expanded our work at Lachish, and then my colleague, Professor Garfinkel, has moved on to Khirbet El-Rai in 2015. So we really are looking at how did the kingdom of Judah expand during the time of David, Solomon, Rehoboam, and then after that, finding a timeline really to deal with this chronological issue that we're facing right now in the debate over this period.
So when you in a couple of your articles, one in particular, you mentioned you finished your work at Khirbet Qeiyafa and you went to Lachish, and it was this regional strategy that you had in mind. There was a number of reasons for it, but that was one. So what are some of the things that you were kind of looking for at Lachish? I mean, it's been dug 3 times, but obviously there's more work to do. Maybe lay out the debate or the issues that are there as it relates to chronology and the kingdom of Judah at this time.
Well, Lachish during the Tel Aviv expedition, the third expedition, really was the linchpin that started the whole debate over the low chronology. They uncovered a gate there that that was dated later than the Solomonic gates at Hatzor, at Gezer, and Megiddo. And they then argued, well, these gates actually are later and don't date to the time of Solomon. So that's where the debate really began. And we know that many of these cities are only excavated at a fraction of the amount that can be excavated there. You and I, Henry, worked at Hatzor years ago, and we know that probably 700 years of excavation could continue at that particular site.
Yes.
And that's true for Lachish as well. So we moved to the northeastern segment of the site that had not been hardly excavated before. The British had excavated a bit around the fortification system, but it was largely neglected by the previous expeditions. We strategically looked for a place right next to where Aharoni had dug in the 1960s, where he had found a complete sequence of all the strata, starting with level 1 all the way down to level 5. And we worked right adjacent to him. So that's the area that I worked in. My colleagues worked along the edge of the site looking at the fortification system. The previous expeditions had never found any evidence for the fortifications of Rehoboam that's spoken of in Second Chronicles, where he refortifies all these cities, either in preparation for Shishak, the pharaoh of Egypt's campaign, or in response to it. There's a debate about that, but we have good evidence here now for this sequence, and we're trying to redefine and redate this sequence again based on radiocarbon dating and based on the pottery and the ceramic typology that we're excavating as well, and the architecture, of course, that we're looking for too.
Yeah, it's interesting in the biblical text. You mentioned that previously Solomon had fortified numerous cities. We found evidence that's consistent with that. And here you're saying that Rehoboam did the same at Lachish. You got about 30 seconds or so. Maybe just give a taste of that, a little bit about what you have found consistent with that, and then we'll pick it up in the next segment.
Yeah, so we basically were looking along that fortification line. We were looking for, of course, you always have to start at the top and work your way down. So we're starting with level 1 and looking for fortifications, trying to find that evidence that might be there for the rebuilding of Rehoboam. And that was a challenge, but I think we came to some very, very good conclusions that we can talk about next.
That would be great. Well, friends, I'm here today with Dr. Michael Hasel. We're talking about the city of Lachish, its importance in biblical history around the time of the formation of the state of Judah. And with that word, we'll be right back after this message. Please don't go away.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Michael Hasel, archaeologist with 30 years of experience in the field, talking about the city of Lachish. Now, in our previous segment, we were talking about fortifications. You were talking about strata, layers. For someone brand new to archaeology, that's simply as you dig down slowly and record everything. It's like draining a bathtub. We do it evenly. We don't dig holes, right? And we record everything we find. The further down you go, the further back in time you go. So that's a little tutorial for those who are new to archaeology. Let's pick up on, though, the fortifications that you were discussing about the time of Rehoboam. These are points of conflict in different paradigms that view biblical history a little bit differently. Maybe we could just talk about that a little.
Right. Again, the argument from silence, right? If you don't find something, often people will say, well, it didn't happen or it wasn't there. So there has been no evidence at Lachish in all these years since the 1930s and 3 previous expeditions that the site was fortified at all. during the 10th century, as the Bible describes in 2nd Chronicles, when it says that Rehoboam refortified these cities in Judah, and Lachish is specifically mentioned. So one of our strategies was, again, to begin at the very top and work our way down along this northeastern part of the site, which I believe was very strategic because that's where one of the major water sources is, and where we have the river going by on the outside of the site as well. So we began working in that particular location. We started we found the level 1 wall, which is the Persian period. We got down, and right underneath that was a level 2 wall, and we'll see this in the graphics as well. Then the level 3 wall underneath that, level 3 and 4, which dates to the time of the 8th and 9th centuries. And then underneath that, and again, this is how stratigraphy works, we find this massive stone wall that had never been uncovered before. We find 30 feet of this stone wall as it extends around the northeastern part of the site. And we have a drain that comes out of this wall, and we find underneath the mud brick walls of level 3 and 4, which dates to the time of Hezekiah and Azariah, some of the earlier kings, we find a very nice floor attached in a very small area, but a very nice floor attached to that stone wall from level 5. It has to be level 5 because there's another wall just below it that comes from an earlier period, from the late Bronze Age. So it's very it's very clear stratigraphically, and we found in that small area of the floor, we found olive pits that we could send off for radiocarbon dating. And the radiocarbon dating results from Oxford University came back. We have, again, this regional approach for radiocarbon dating where we're comparing Khirbet Qeiyafa with Lachish, with Khirbet El Rai. And what we find in all of these levels that we've excavated at Lachish, which goes all the way up in levels 4 and also in level 3, is that we have a very, very clear sequencing, very clear stratigraphic samples. We've got the pottery, of course, we've got the ceramics, but then we have the carbon dates that back those up as well. And guess what? They very clearly support the traditional chronology that we find in the Bible, which is something that archaeologists took for granted until about 20 years ago or so when this was challenged. But prior to that time, everybody accepted this chronology, and most archaeologists, I would say, still do today.
Well, I think you just answered the question of why a 4th expedition to Lachish, because no matter how good of a job previous expeditions may have done, there's always more evidence to uncover if there's a portion of the site that hasn't been dug. And this is a lesson for the church, arguments from silence about the Bible. We should wait on the archaeology and trust what God has said first. That's what I always say to the church layman. Trust what God has said. The archaeology may or may not bear that out. We'll find out. But it's hard work, and it needs to be done. It needs to be done meticulously, as you have done. Now, I do want to shift a little bit. We're going to shift away from that controversy for a little while, because Lachish is best known for Sennacherib's invasion and destruction of the city in 701. But you guys found a fascinating find from that period, and I'll let you share what that is.
Yes, of course, going through all of those levels to get down, you have to go through what is known as level 3, which is the city of the 8th century that was destroyed by Sennacherib's armies. Clearly, he shows this in his palace at Nineveh. There's a huge series of panels in his palace without rival at Nineveh that show this campaign against Lachish. It's shown to be very accurate to what we actually have in the field as well. We know kind of where the person was standing as they were taking notes and doing this artwork, or at least sketching it for the palace back home. But we found a small dipper juglet, very small dipper juglet, and inside the dipper juglet, just as Aharoni had found in the 1960s, he found a dipper juglet with 17 seal impressions. We found inside this tiny dipper juglet 2 seal impressions, and then we began sifting around it, and we found several more seal impressions around that as well. And those seal impressions, of course, are extremely important. We call them bullae. They're extremely important. They're about the size of your thumbnail, but they are seal impressions, or the personal signature, if you will, of the individuals that placed this on a document and then sent it by courier to another city. They broke that seal off. And so these seal impressions probably were kept in this little juglet as a proof of receipt and and we have that evidence, and of course they mention people's names on them, as you've had on a previous program recently in Jerusalem. Hezekiah, the king's name, was found
Yes.
on a seal impression. Just 10 feet away from that seal impression in Jerusalem was found a seal impression that may be Isaiah, the prophet, just right in that context. So these seal impressions are extremely important to give us some ideas about this history. And in Isaiah chapter 37, we have a verse that mentions all of these individuals we've just talked about. It says, when King Hezekiah heard it, that is, that Sennacherib was coming against the city, he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and entered the house of the Lord. Then he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, with Shebna the scribe and the elders of the priests, covered with sackcloth, to Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz. So we have 4 people mentioned here that are all extremely important to this period of history and this event. We know from Jerusalem that both Hezekiah's seal impression has been found, and now Isaiah's seal impression is found. We know from previous excavations that we also have evidence for Shebna outside of the Bible, the scribe mentioned here. But the seal impression, 2 of the seal impressions that we found impressed with the same seal, is actually the seal impression of Eliakim. And so for the first time in history, we have Eliakim, who is also mentioned in this passage, who is head over the household or the palace. Sometimes he's called the overseer of the palace. He is the individual, probably second in command, or at least a very important official in the territory of Judah. And he's sending a message to Lachish. And we have these seal impressions now kept there, and we found those after 2,700 years. So very, very exciting discovery that happened in 2014.
It was remarkable. Well, we're coming up on a break, folks. Don't go away. We will be right back.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host Henry Smith. I'm here with Archaeologist Dr. Michael Hasel. We're talking about the city of Lachish. Now, Mike, in our last segment, we were talking about these incredible seals that have been discovered. You also found something. Now we're going to go back in time. We're going to shift a little bit back in this Canaanite period. We think is from the period of the Judges. You found a temple at Lachish. Tell the audience about that. It's really, really interesting.
Well, that's what's fascinating with archaeology. You go with certain goals to find, the Iron Age sequence, which we uncovered in most of the areas where we excavated. We had a very nice Iron Age sequence, as we described. But then you have surprises because archaeology is not that predictable. You never know what you're going to uncover, right?
Yes.
And so here we uncovered a late Bronze Age temple. We have a huge late Bronze Age temple on the Acropolis of the site. And that was discovered by Ushishkin's team in the 70s and 80s when he was excavating there. We also have the Foss Temple, another late Bronze Age temple, which was located outside of the city, at the base of the city in the western part of the site. But now we have a third temple. And this was a smaller temple than the Acropolis temple. This was a temple that was very nicely designed, but it gives us an insight into the Canaanite period at Lachish and so much of the religion that was going on during that time. We have these smiting gods that we uncovered, probably a representation of either Baal or Resheph. We have these cauldrons that were probably placed as foundation deposits, huge ones that are one right on top of the other. We've only found a few of those in the entire southern Levant in different sites. So those were really, really exciting discoveries. And so we have this temple. We can talk a little bit now more about what worship. We believe that it was close to an open area, close to a gate that we uncovered along the fortification line in that northeastern part of the site. And so just as we have at Shechem and at other sites, we have in the Middle Bronze Age, we have gates located close to temples, or temples located close to gates as people came in. This might have been some kind of a royal temple that was very significant as people walked into the city and could worship there. So again, very exciting discovery, and that we just published that last year, and that was all over the news as well, because we don't find a lot of these temples in the Bronze Age.
Yeah, first of all, the archaeology is just so exciting, and it is true. I mean, we have the same thing happen at Makadar, which was a much smaller site, and a lot of it was eroded. But we found we were looking for is this Joshua's Eye? We find this New Testament city there, thousands of coins and a couple thousand coins and all of this first century kind of stuff. And it's like, well, we kind of knew it was there, but then it's like you get into it because that's not what you were expecting to find, but that's what archaeology brings you, a lot of surprises. Another thought, and maybe you could just build on this a little bit more, is the complexity of what's happening in Israel in the Judges period. It's not this clean thing where they come in and they just take over the whole land. It's complex, and the archaeology shows the influence of continued Canaanite paganism in the land persisting for quite a period of time.
Right, and of course, you see that in the first chapter of Judges right away. Jerusalem, of course, is not taken by the Israelites; it remains the Jebusite city. You see, Gezer is not conquered by Israel because the Canaanites are dwelling there. It doesn't come into the hands of Israel until the time of Solomon, because he marries one of the Egyptian princesses, according to 1 Kings 9, 15, and 16. So Bet Shean is not taken in the northern part. You have these enclaves of Canaanite presence. And what's interesting with Lachish is we know that it's mentioned during the conquest, but then you have this gap where it's not mentioned in the Bible at all until the time of Rehoboam. And it's interesting that we have these Canaanite temples that are very late in the sequence of the Bronze Age. I mean, they happen right at the very end in the 12th century, actually, before the monarchy. But then we have this gap of occupation altogether at Lachish. All the expeditions so far, unless there's another part of the city we don't know about, but all the expeditions so far have found this gap of 150 to 200 years between the end of the late Bronze Age and the 10th century, the time of Rehoboam. And so what happened during that time? And that's where our other site comes in, the site of Khirbet El Rai, because that's only 3 kilometers to the west, and that site is occupied precisely at the time when Lachish appears to be abandoned. And perhaps there's a shift in population that takes place during that time. Khirbet El Rai is another Khirbet Kayafa. It was occupied early on during the early 10th century and the 11th century, so it dates to the time of Saul and David as well. And then it is pretty much abandoned after Lachish comes to prominence again in the Iron Age. So we have this seesawing effect, as some of the scholars have called it, where these sites gain prominence and then another site nearby gains prominence as that city is destroyed and different things happen. So this is part of the exciting thing of excavating these places and trying to establish that chronological sequence that we can understand better the growth of Judah, how that growth took place. And what we see with all of these sites, and there's more, there's Tel Burna now where Steve Ortiz and others are excavating. There is Tel Zayat. There's Khirbet Sumeli where Jimmy Harden is excavating and Jeff Blakely. There's a growing number of 10th century sites in the Shephelah in this region that are now mushrooming after Khirbet Kayafa was found, where we have increasing evidence for this settlement and this movement, which these weren't known in 1996 when the low chronology was proposed. Yes. And so now we have a new amount of data coming up that really supports the growth, the establishment and the growth of the kingdom of Judah in a way that we didn't know before. And that's why archaeology is so important, That's why the work that you folks are doing is so important. We need to continue to remain in the field as much as we can, because it is that continued research that provides new data that allows some of these paradigms to shift and to move, and also allows us to find more evidence that supports what we know already from Scripture and what we already accept as being truth. So digging for truth is important.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for coming on the program. We appreciate your work so much. And friends, you can tell from what Dr. Hasel had to share, his expertise in archaeology and its importance related to the Bible. You can trust the Scriptures. The archaeology bears that out. Thank you for joining us today.